So wonderful to have so many of you here amidst us for a conference on social change. Indeed, you know, what's beautiful about this gathering is that we have students amid us, we have faculty, more importantly, we have community activists and civil society organizations and community members. It truly is a pleasure to have such a gathering because after all, the process of social change requires all of these actors to come together. So hopefully for the next couple of days, we will learn various lessons from all these different stakeholders about the kind of work that you're doing and what it takes to bring you together in pursuing an agenda of social change. What I thought I will do in this opening conversation is lay out some of the key concepts of social change communication, talk a little bit about why we should talk about agendas of social change, then discuss the culture-centered approach and the work we are doing at CARE a little bit, and wrap up with some questions on communication for social change that hopefully we can take up in the next few days to learn about the processes of change. So the first question that I will put on the map is, why do we need to talk about communication for social change? Why do we need social change? So what I will do in order to set up the agenda for social change is identify some of the key trends that we observe globally when we look at the data on the map. As you know, I love pictures, so I thought that I will share in an image with you that captures a lot of the data that I'm going to discuss. These are images from the region of Rohingya refugees that are in search of a home. The plight of the Rohingya refugees bring together questions of health, questions of social justice, questions of environmental displacement and climate change, questions of nationhood and belonging, questions of refugees and refugee acceptance and migration, as well as questions of neoliberalism and global market economics. All of these underlie then some of the broad trends that we observe today when we look at the globe. As we observe interpenetrating global boundaries that is often celebrated in the media literature, in talking about transmedia flows, transnational flows, cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan citizenship, hybridities, and cultural mixing, we also need to remember that these interpenetrating global boundaries produce interstices of erasure. Communities at the margins that are erased from these interpenetrating networks because of these interpenetrating connections. So the idea of global village in that sense is quite a paradox. The global village for some also means that there are many displaced communities out of their own local villages so that we can afford to have global villages. So ideas of cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan citizenship are ideas on one hand are enabled by technology, on the other hand produce the kinds of inaccess that we need to challenge and question. Moreover, these cosmopolitan connections then also offer us entry points then for talking about marginalization and disenfranchisement and finding spaces of solidarity. So how can we sort of work through this paradox of connectivity as a way for disempowerment, but connectivity also as a way for advocating for social justice? Yet another trend that we observe globally is the power of financial capital. Certainly we see that in Singapore, we see that in London and in New York, but we see that as a global phenomenon in terms of the consolidation of power in the hands of finance, but also the financialization of global relationships and global value chains. Relationships of agriculture, relationships of households, relationships of families have all been turned into financial models that can be transacted into the marketplace. This, I believe, produces important ramifications in terms of what it means for the lives of people and communities. One of the projects that we carry out, it's an ongoing project in China, is with families that are left behind when children migrate to the cities of production in places like Shenzhen, right? So Shenzhen as a city for production of transnational capital also tells another story, which is the story of erasure of families and familial relationships in societies such as China. So what are the implications of these kinds of movements? We also witness environmental risks and disproportionate burdens that are being borne by the poor. So whether you go to US, to New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, or you go to the Chennai floods more recently, one of the things that you observe is that it's never the people in the gated communities that bear the risks of the environment. Just as similarly, it is not the global north that bears the risks of the environment. It is the global south, and particularly the poor in the global south, that must face the risks of the environment and bear the burdens. So you look at neighboring Bangladesh and you look at the displaced communities across the river Podda, communities living in the embankments of Podda, and as the river increases in size because of climate change patterns, these are families that are displaced from their sources of livelihood. David Harvey talks about this as displacement by dispossession. So part of the neoliberal system of global organizing is the displacement of communities by their disposition from their sources of livelihood. So when we think about social change, I think one of the important questions to think about is what are the accounts of dispossession, how is dispossession being produced, and what are the ramifications, particularly health ramifications, environmental ramifications, ramifications to well-being that are produced by these forms of displacement. So migration is a global phenomenon today. And there is flow of labor with international division of labor and international flow of capital, flow of labor into spaces, particularly as labor becomes more vulnerable in global markets. So neoliberalism, or the project of neoliberalism, if you think about it as a direct attack on forms of labor and the organizing capacity of labor, one of the things that is produced in this process is the flexibility of movement of labor across global boundaries. So that has produced the kinds of precariousness that we witness in the work that we do, for instance, with migrant construction workers or domestic workers, with minimum security, with minimum capacity to unionize, and with minimum access to basic social welfare and things such as health insurance, such that when a worker has a fall at a work site, he does not have access to treatment, he is shipped back to Bangladesh without being treated and without having the ability to work further. So that kind of demonstrates the ways in which the movement of capital works on the movement of labor. So the global flows of jobs are accompanied by rising unemployment rates, but something that is more pertinent to us is the student debts that you see across countries. So this, of course, also connects with the student protests that you're seeing now globally. So as academia, as people that are thinking about these social change processes, it's worthwhile to remember that this is not just taking place somewhere out there beyond our realm. These are the kinds of questions that relate to us in terms of how academia is organized, what it means to have access to knowledge, who has access to knowledge, who pays for this knowledge, questions like that. There's also increasing concentration of power as well as wealth in the hands of transnational elite. Of course, this has been documented by a number of economists, the most recent work being that of Thomas Piketty, that clearly outlines the ways in which wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of global elite, and the gaps between the haves and have-nots are continuing to rise. In that context, then, the question of social change is also a question of redistribution of resources and questions of economic power in terms of who should or should not have access to economic resources. But also transnational power inequalities, which are geographical, deriving from the power of the nation state, meaning that the nation state continues to be relevant. Nation states continue to be powerful actors in asserting their power in framing global policy circuits and global policy conversations. If you, for instance, think about the most recent policy discussions on Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which is a partnership that connects multiple countries in the Asia-Pacific. That conversation on the TPP is ultimately driven by nation states and national actors. So it's worthwhile to think through the role of the nation state. I would argue that the nation state in the context of global capital continues to be just as relevant or even more relevant than it was about a decade back. So within these global trajectories then, we observe patterns of climate change, global growing inequalities, increasing marginalization of the poorer sectors of the globe. Now this is important. So this marginalization, I will argue, is not only structural marginalization in terms of not having access to economic resources, but it is also communicative marginalization in terms of the poor not having access to platforms where they could voice their ideas. So this is an important point in terms of communication for social change, asking questions such as what does it mean for the communication avenues that are available for us in carrying out agendas of social change. To what extent are these avenues actually available to the poor for their voices to be heard? Who is controlling these avenues? To what extent and for what purposes? There is also, along with this, increasing reliance on experts to carry out policies and programs. So part of the problem is the academic production of knowledge in order to carry out social change communication. Meaning that to the extent that social change communication has historically been constructed as an expert-driven framework, where academic experts will come in, they will fly into a country and design solutions and leave, that works hand in hand with the neoliberal model. Because it undervalues community knowledge, it undervalues community resources, and instead places on top of that a dominant framework that can work in order to perpetuate the interests of the status quo. So I want to point, when talking about this, in terms of the broader agenda of social change communication, when you think about the way in which the literature has come to be. So if you traditionally think about how we think about social change communication, much of it is conceptualized within the framework of development communication, where the emphasis is on individual behavior change. So think about the early social change communication interventions. What were they? Most of these interventions were designed by elite actors, trained by elite institutions, usually with an MP, Masters of Public Health, or with an MBA or a Masters in Communication, that were deployed in these countries, often paid by foundations such as the Ford Foundation or the Carnegie Foundation, or by development agencies like United States Agency for International Development, in order to carry out the agendas of dominant power structures and power actors. So, quite ironically then, the agenda of social change was what? To carry out the interests of the status quo, of the power elite, focusing instead on individual behavioral modification. So the goal of social change campaigns was on telling women in Peru that, hey, you got to reproduce less. Right? So a lot of these campaigns and programs were entertainment education programs and campaigns and interventions that were targeted at individual behavior, addressing issues of individual behavior as if those were the problems, never really addressing structural inequities, issues of social justice, or the inequities that were produced by the very structures that were funding the social change actors. So I think it's important to question the role that experts like us have played in the social change process and the ways in which we have been complicit in reproducing and circulating the inequities that we see today. So in that sense, academia is very much a part of the neoliberal model in propagating and reproducing the neoliberal model rather than an antithesis to it. I think engaging with that point becomes a key point for us to sort of ask questions about what the agenda of social change means. So when you think about countries like Indonesia or the Philippines or India, you think about the kind of academics that were funded by USAID to carry out its programs. These were academics who were complicit with the power structure to sing the stories of the power structure. I think that's an important point in terms of thinking about the role of academics as the bourgeois. So you have people from elite families and elite networks that have access to the right kind of resources that get paid in order to sing the songs of USAID within these contexts. And I think when we understand that, it becomes important to delineate then what we really mean by social change communication. Along with this then, we see the depletion of democratic possibilities. So it's quite interesting that as we see increasing number of democracy promotion campaigns across the world, we see increasing talk of democracy in material terms in global communities of the global south. There is depletion of democratic possibilities, meaning that communities of poor have increasingly less and less access to platforms to actually voice their concerns, their opinions, and their agendas. And there is increasing violence on the role of police and military. So we see the militarization of countries, of nation states, and we see the ways in which military is deployed in order to carry out this broad agenda. You only need to look at, for instance, the Occupy movement, right? And the ways in which the Occupy movement was dealt with through the use of police and the use of force in order to silence opportunities of protest and opportunities of articulation. So the role of communication in the traditional sense of social change communication has been to produce and reproduce communicative inequalities. What does that mean? To the extent that we believe that we are the experts, we have expert knowledge to give to communities by increasing their knowledge, by changing their attitudes or changing their behavior, we are intrinsic to the production of communicative inequalities. We rob communities of their ideas, of their sources of knowledge, of their agentic expressions in order to create spaces for us to develop solutions for them, directed at them. Yet another idea is the notion of communicative inversions, which is that much of mainstream communication scholarship has been intrinsic to carrying out the propaganda for dominant coalitions in order to invert realities, in order to portray ideas and imaginations that carry out the agendas of the status quo. Let me sort of demonstrate this by one example, but before we get to that, thinking about communicative inequalities and inversions, we need to ask questions such as, who holds the power in shaping communicative processes? Where does the power lie? Who owns the communication platforms? Who owns the communication infrastructures? In the work of DDS, for instance, they talk about the ways in which community radio across the world are struggling in order to own the airwaves, because much of the airwaves have been privatized. If you think about the dominant model of communication, the model is based on an advertising-driven model. Who can pay for the advertising? So the advertisers, in that sense, control the agenda of what gets communicated. Think about for what purposes. What are the broader goals that are being served? With what agendas? What are the agendas that are being put forth? So if you, for instance, think about social change solutions, let me give you an example. I recently was reviewing development projects that were being carried out in Indonesia, funded by transnational corporations and carried out by local NGOs and elite networks on promoting clean drinking water in Indonesia. Now something, commonsensically somebody should ask, why do we need to promote clean drinking water? Isn't that a natural resource? Isn't that a natural right? Should we all not have access to clean drinking water? And what are the actual kinds of processes that are producing unclean water? That then takes into looking at environmental pollution, upstream pollution of river streams and water bodies. But the solution is what? Privatized clean drinking water that poor communities can buy, and that is presented as if that can be subsidized. Similarly, think about the example of air. You think about haze around us. Singapore suffers from the problem of haze certain times of the air. Now you have marketing companies that come up with a brilliant social marketing idea. They want to package clean air. You see how far it goes. And I think the very model of developing solutions within this structure works toward funding the structure and increasing and consolidating power in the hands of structure, rather than asking fundamental questions such as, we need to develop advocacy to prevent the pollution of water. We need to develop advocacy tools to prevent the pollution of air, which would mean that we need to actually work on addressing the companies that are polluting the environment by cutting down the rainforests, right? But those kinds of issues remain outside of the policy agenda. So in that sense then, these kinds of communicative inequalities of representation and recognition are produced by structural inequities in terms of access to resources and access to policies and programs. So in that sense, I would argue, and it's a fairly cynical argument, that much of social change work funded in the mainstream, funded by mainstream actors, works to perpetuate the agendas of the dominant structures. So it is framed as social change, but what it really does is to actually consolidate more resources for the wealthy and carry out through marketing and advertising programs projects that fundamentally bring more wealth into the hands of the rich. So narratives in this sense within these dominant structures fundamentally produce inequalities. What messages get circulated through dominant communication infrastructures? We need to ask this question. What are the stories told on mainstream media, and what agendas are served by these stories? So when you think about, for instance, solutions such as, and I will go to another example, large number of social change communication projects, for instance, address the issues of family planning. When you ask this question, what are the solutions to family planning that are promoted through these projects? You often see that the kinds of solutions that are promoted are individual level solutions about people needing to adopt planning behavior, but also solutions that are directed at the market, meaning that people usually need to buy some kind of product. Yeah? People need to buy some kind of product in order to engage in behavior. And often this then is tied to creating markets for these products, be it contraceptive products or be it condoms, products that are tied to agendas of transnational capital. So communicative inversions in this sense reproduce and perpetuate the status quo by reversing the materiality and the manifestations of materiality. Let me show this with an example. This is early US campaign funded through USAID, but you can relate, I'm sure many of you, through these images. Socialism, throttling the country. What underlies this message, or these dominant sets of messages? That to talk about equality, to talk about equity are what? Unacceptable, are out of the norm. We cannot talk about agendas of equality and equity because they will throttle the country. This is the kind of stigma that we will see have produced the sorts of effects that we witness in communities in Indonesia. But these are the kinds of stigmas that are also tied to large-scale killing of people. Unfortunately, communication for social change has been at the heart of this. Communication people through their PR work and propaganda work have been intrinsic to generating these kinds of images, sitting in the status quo that have perpetuated the kind of violence we see in the world today, such that we do not have an anchor to neoliberalism. We do not have a counter anchor to critiquing the market. That has been taken away, systematically but surely, mostly funded through development interventions. Here's another one. If Russia should win, if Russia and the communists should win the next World War, many Americans, men, would be sterilized. In case the communists should conquer, our women would be helpless beneath the boots of the Asiatic Russians. Funded, again, by US government and carried out by academics. Academics amidst us that we cite and we quote and we celebrate. Important point, but we do not offer this critique or we do not touch that holy cow. But that sacred cow needs to be touched if we fundamentally need to unpack this idea of social change communication and really ask the question about what materialities are and what realities are. Because you see, in this process, what communication has done in this sense is taken away the space to talk about social justice, to talk about equality, to talk about redistribution of resources, because of course that would be abnormal, aberrant, out of the norm. So social change communication has traditionally worked for the status quo, to reproduce the dominant structures, individualizing responsibility, and at the same time creating open markets for transnational capital. So actors in social change communication, these are the traditional actors in the social change communication network. You have transnational capital, which funds many social change campaigns, often through foundations and foundations that are connected to corporations, civil society, state funding agencies such as USAID and DFID. Then you have the elites, the managerial classes, and sites of knowledge production. And surely if we interrogate within, what we will find is that many of us belong in these classes. That's the key point, right? That many of us belong in these classes. So then we have to ask this fundamental question, what are we doing here? What role are we playing? Who is paying for us? And what agendas are we carrying out as participants in this knowledge network? So in this dominant framework then, democracy and capitalism work hand in hand with technology, with state, society, and market to put forth and reproduce a system that works on the basis of the disenfranchisement of the poor. But within that then, academe is a key player. And academe has traditionally worked to reproduce the kinds of knowledge claims that bolster and reproduce this status quo of democracy, capitalism, and technology. So social change communication in this sense is reproduced through academic enterprise that is complicit with the status quo, that is complicit with imperial agendas. So many of our funding, for instance, for the projects that we carried out that are funded on the large scale are funded by the status quo, such as development agencies. Now, one of the questions that is often asked is, can you carry out a project on the small scale that is funded by one of these structures but can be radical in its imagination? I think that's a question worth asking, but at the same time, one ought not to be naive about the agendas of these broader structures. I will also argue, and this is a critique of the cultural studies framework in this sense, is the inability of cultural studies to engage with political economy, such that cultural studies has all become about culture and celebrating culture and cultural forms without really engaging questions of political economy and questions of structures, such that the production of knowledge about cultural processes itself has become a bourgeois elite enterprise at the center, without any interest in decentering or asking questions about the margins. So these remain sites of privilege and power that remain uninterrogated and intact. So we as academics are not open to asking questions about where do we inherit our power from and what does it mean in terms of how we inherit this power. So to reimagine social change. Now I have outlined how we have thought about social change traditionally. So if we are to reimagine social change, the first entry point to this is to decenter knowledge. To decenter knowledge means to look at communities outside of academic structures as sources of knowledge production, where theory and practice are guided by communities at the margins. And here I put theory and practice because I really believe that you cannot have theory without practice. You cannot theorize, for instance, about cultural processes of production without engaging with practices of communities at the margins that are marginalized through these processes. Listening to voices of the margins are entry points for change, but that highlights a key element, which is listening. One of the challenges for us as academics is how do we open up these spaces for listening? Or how do we listen when our education has taught us to believe in our expertise? When our education has taught us with that PhD to believe that we have the solution. You know, how often am I surprised when I'm in a community of academics and then with disenfranchised communities, that even before the community gets to outline what it is doing, the academics will come in and say, oh, you should do this. Why aren't you doing this? You should do that. You should be doing this, this, and this. So that approach in and of itself is an imperial approach that assumes that as an academic you can come into the community and tell it what it needs to do without having any clue really about what the community is or where it belongs. So this calls for solidarity with the margins in projects of social change. I say solidarity because solidarity is not a one-time thing. I cannot walk into Singapore, collect 3 days of data and think that I now understand the community. Solidarity is a long-term project. Over the course of time, with many projects that we carry out at CARE, we work on our projects for 3-4 years before we can even think of publishing. Because solidarity means that you spend time listening, understanding, trying to collaborate and come together. The commitment to creating spaces for social change then talks about commitment as a long-term involvement. It's not a one-off thing. It's not an extractive relationship where you take the data out of the community and you publish that work, but rather a commitment to the community in terms of asking about what you give to the community in that relationship. And disrupting the communicative inversion circulated in the mainstream. Ultimately then, hopefully this solidarity creates entry points for disruptions of the communicative inversions. Social change then can go from micro to meso to macro. Micro meaning they can be small scale within the realms of communities. They can be meso within the realm of governments and state structures, or they can be macro, global in their nature. So I will briefly outline the theoretical framework of the culture-centered approach that says that to understand this process of change, we need to look at how cultural structure and agency interplay with an emphasis on agency of the margins, with the idea that the margins have their agency. Marginalized communities have always been speaking. So when we are asked this question, can the subaltern speak? The answer to that is fairly straightforward. The subaltern has always spoken. So how then can we work on projects of social change so that we can actually listen to the subaltern voices? And the other element then, with that method of social change, is how do we bring civil society and political community together with communities at the margins and academic knowledge to amplify community voices. So CC as a method uses a variety of techniques. I have outlined some of these. The main element there is to think about how community advisory boards become sites of storytelling and as ways for policy interventions. But the key elements of the method, and I will highlight these points, hopefully we will touch upon them as we go through our presentations in the next couple of days. One is the idea of partnership. What does it mean to partner? What does it mean for academics to come together with activists and to come together with the community? The second idea is the idea of listening. What does it mean to truly listen? What kinds of tools do we need to listen? And what kind of processes do we need to go through as academics so that we can listen? The third point is reflexivity. How can we reflect upon our own positions of power and the ways in which these positions silence? And through that, can we open up spaces for conversation? The fourth point is solidarity. What does it mean to create spaces of partnership between academics and communities so that they can come together in processes of change? The next point is authenticity. How can we be authentic? How can we be truthful to the relationships that we create with communities so that we don't just take community stories and turn them into things that benefit us, but rather are guided by a commitment of truth in the relationship. And finally, commitment, meaning that how do we sustain these relationships over a long period of time, that extend over a period of time. So these are the questions methodologically that I leave for you. For the last segment of this presentation, I will go through one project and highlight some of the questions, but the way we will do that is by listening to community voices and seeing how community at the margins, in a displacement-based context where indigenous communities are fighting their displacement by a mining company, are talking about development and are talking back to the structures. And there, I think, lies the hope for social change. So as Naomi is pulling this together, what we will see in this particular example of social change is what happens when a community voices its marginalization. In this particular context, it's an indigenous community that has systematically been disenfranchised, often through the use of police force, under the development articulation that the community is getting into the way of national development. Okay? Because the mining project, it is argued, would bring about development. is an example of what happens when the community has the power to tell its story and it inverts the dominant narrative you listen to in social change communication that would suggest, for instance, that mining brings about development. Yeah? So this is an example in terms of the power of listening as a way to create avenues for social change. The question for us then broadly, thinking about an outline for a conversation on social change communication, is what are the kinds of strategies of listening that one needs to think about, or how does one even go about beginning to listen when one considers opportunities for social change communication. This evening, later, when we listen to the performances of our colleagues, performers and activists from Indonesia, we will hopefully witness the power of storytelling as a way for challenging the dominant narratives, but also as a way for fighting stigmas that are attached to the dominant ways of storytelling. As we chart out a trajectory of social change communication and imagine possibilities of social change projects, it's worthwhile to consider then, given the power of capital to control the communicative avenues and the communicative sources and the communicative channels, what then are the possibilities for resisting, for transforming, for creating spaces that work in solidarity with communities that are otherwise disenfranchised? What then also are possibilities for rethinking narratives of development, for instance? I'll give you an example as I wrap up. You think about the problem of climate change and the ways in which it is framed in the broad literature. In the literature as well as in mainstream policy circle, what is the solution to climate change? More technology. So we talk about making communities more adaptive by coming up with smart technologies of adaptation and teaching communities to adapt. Forgetting the fundamental paradox that we are in this place with human-induced climate change because of a technology-centered, West-centric paradigm. So in some ways, to communicate about social change calls upon us to imagine alternative rationalities, alternative ways of being that challenge the techno-determinism of the broader development framework. But hopefully also alternative ways of being that embolden us to imagine new possibilities, new conversations, and new threads. I'll wrap up with that, and I'm looking forward to this conference, looking forward to your papers, looking forward to the wonderful presentations, and to 2 days of learning. Thank you.